Yali has written books, Yali Lincroft has written books and papers detailing necessary policy changes at the state and federal levels, and has helped social workers, attorneys, and others work effectively to improve the outcomes for these populations. Some of her latest works, she's very prolific, include a 2-credit course on immigration procedure for social workers through the National Association of Social Workers. We're going to hear later about that in a separate meeting so that we can get social workers locally online and getting credit for learning more about immigration process. And a report she recently wrote called Caught Between Systems, the Impact of Immigration Enforcement on Child Welfare. I'd like to introduce with great pride for such a great advocate, Yali Lincroft.
Thank you, Lori. It's truly an honor to be here today. I represent First Focus Campaign for Children. We're a bipartisan national organization housed in Washington, D.C., and we're dedicated to making children and families a priority in state and federal policy decisions. It's appropriate that we're having this event right next door to the Children's Center over there. And as we watch the children enjoy their childhood like all kids do, let's just remember that. These are our children. So my presentation will focus on the current national landscape. Each year, as we're now in January, brings us hope for policy reform and changes. And realistically, policy reform in 2012 will probably not be with the 112th Congress, which is generally considered one of the least productive Congress in 60 years. Rather, reforms and changes in 2012 will most likely be happening with all of you, the children's advocate and the policy champions happening at the state legislation level. So throughout the country, there's really been draconian cuts in all social services for all kids and programs. For example, I'm from California, even though my agency's in DC, and we recently have seen child welfare agencies cut their staffing anywhere by 20 to 40%. And our governor has recently proposed a $1 billion cut to safety net programs like TANF, child care subsidies, mental health. These are dark days indeed for all vulnerable families, U.S. citizens and immigrants. And the conversation at the state and federal levels is all about jobs, it's all about the economy. So what are we talking about here in this climate in this state? After your state, Arizona, enacted your SB 1070 legislation and controversial Show Your Papers bill, conventional wisdom would have it that other states would be lining up to copy this destructive, enforcement-only approach to immigration. And there has been some prominent copycat bills. We've seen them in states like Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and recently Missouri, which has just introduced legislation attacking the educational rights of children. However, the vast majority of states have rejected similar bills, and this widespread rejection has been largely due in no small part to the efforts of the business community. They are acutely aware of the deep economic pain and social upheaval that has accompanied the passage of SB 1070, and all of you know it. All of you are living it here. So it's not good for business, it's not good for kids, and these punitive state ledgers are also been largely defeated because of you, the intensive advocacy on the part of faith-based, community, and children's agencies. So to all of you who have worked hard on these campaigns, I applaud and I commend you, and I want to say these campaigns work, they make a difference. Over the last 2 years, the states have increasingly turned toward common sense legislation that welcomes economic contributions of and the taxes paid by our immigrants and non-immigrant communities. One of the chief ways, and I'm hoping this is a sort of a positive light on light of sort of all the negative things we're talking about here, but one of the positive ways we've seen this is the advancing of tuition equity measures, some known as DREAM Act at the federal level, but also what you guys are doing on the local level, some plus and some not. So already enacted in 14 states, we have tuition equity measures which allow our talented, undocumented young students to attend state universities like this at the same rate as their U.S. citizen, legal, or permanent resident classmates. They're on the agenda again in 2012 for states like Colorado, Hawaii, and New Mexico. So if we really do care about jobs, if we really want to get out of this economic situation, these tuition equity bills are telling us forward-thinking approach to immigration, one that focuses on helping nurturing young talented youth and putting our tax dollars to better use than destroying families. So if I have a theme to my presentation today, it would be this: saving lives and saving money. When it's heartbreaking to hear the stories that Seth and others are hearing day to day about families, you should also think about the financial motivation why states should not separate families. It's expensive. The foster care system is expensive. It has both immediate and long-term consequences. Immediate costs are court costs. It costs money. Every time a child enters the system, you have to have an attorney assigned to the state, the parent, the child. There's administrative costs, there's emergency health placement, there's foster care placement. The dollars add up very quickly. And sadly, there's long-term costs. We've shown studies over and over again the increased likelihood of children in the foster care system have a higher rate of accessing services like special education, juvenile justice, mental health needs. In fact, a recent GAO report documented the increased use of psychotropic drugs on children in the foster care. Of course, these costs are justifiable when there is clearly a best interest of the child, having the child removed for child welfare. But are these the kids? Are these the families? Really? So throughout the child welfare system, there's just not enough interpreters, translation services, bilingual, bicultural staff. It's a very difficult system for anybody to understand, even if you're a US citizen. So you can imagine if you don't speak the language of the culture. And we see this severe shortage of staff and budgets and social services everywhere, but I think it's particularly acute in the immigrant cases. So given our budget shortfalls, when our communities are struggling to preserve core services like education, fire protection, park services, is this really the best way you want to spend your money, separating families? I want to share some federal legislative solutions, which my client First Focus Campaign for Children have been advocating. There's handouts on the table, one of which is the Help Separated for Children bill that is sponsored by Senator Al Franken and Representative Lynn Woozy, which seeks to protect children and families during the immigration process, including that children who enter the foster care system are able to reunify whenever possible with their detained and deported parents. The bill also allows for a release of designated vulnerable individuals. It limits the presence and involvement of children in enforcement activities and ensures that family members are able to locate them when they're detained. One of the saddest things we heard yesterday when we were at the detention facility was one of the mothers that was telling us that the social worker was using the child as a translator in the case. For those of you who are involved with the child welfare system, this breaks confidentiality, best practices in so many ways. I don't even want to start. But we're hearing about this happening over and over again. One of the things I want to note, it's important to note that the provision of the HELP bill, and in fact many of our recommendations, can be adopted immediately by the administration. It doesn't take a change in law, just leadership and willpower. So I also encourage all of you, as you look at the materials there, many of these changes can be adopted by your state administratively through local laws. But again, leadership, it's not a cost of money, it's a cost of willpower. I commend the Obama administration, which recently has introduced some promising reforms. In 2011, there was a memo from John Morton about prosecutional discretion. That is a critical consideration in the right direction. So the memo specifically said that it recognized the importance of considering whether an individual is a parent of a US citizen child and using that discretion to allow that parent not to be detained. More recently, the administration proposed a regulatory fix to the immigration process that would protect many families from the pain and hardship of being separated by years. So currently, an undocumented immigrant must apply for and receive legal visa from their country of origin to rejoin a spouse and child in the US. That can often mean they have to wait in their country for years and years. The Obama administration is now proposing regulations that allow them to stay in the US. We commend all these things. However, we encourage the administration to move forward now, immediately, because our families are waiting while these processes are taking a long time. The bottom line is this: we need more than proposals from the administration and the state. We need action and we need change immediately. Thank you again for allowing me this time.
Yali, thank you very much for your words and for letting us know what's happening on a national scale. Sometimes we look closely within our own community, we don't realize that there are so many efforts going on for change elsewhere, and we have to keep in touch with our national partners. I also want to apologize, I guess it's a happy apology to the press, because so many of you are here that we seem to have run out of our press releases. But we are going to get some additional copies. And if you sign in, right there, there's a clipboard. We will get those press releases to you and other background materials. All of our speakers are available right after the press conference to talk with you and to do interviews. So please know that you will have opportunities to communicate, both here at the press conference and then during the day. My phone number is there. We can arrange for an interview with any one of our speakers as well as our families. So thank you all for being here, and I do apologize for the shortage of press releases. I also want to point out a few people that are with us today. Keith Bagwell is here representing Supervisor Richard Elias, and Supervisor Elias has expressed a great deal of concern about what is happening to children that are living among us in the community, and sent his representative. Thank you for coming, Keith. And we do have Isaias Nogues here from the consulate, and he's watching very carefully. He has very big eyes, very good for observation. The consulate has been of immeasurable support and has given much help to families here in this community who may require more than an attorney's support. At this time, I'd like to introduce Professor Nina Rabin. She's here at the University of Arizona and also at the Southwest Institute for Research on Women. She has spent several years focused particularly on the rights and needs of women who are detained by ICE. Her recent report about conditions for women here in ICE facilities in Arizona, called Disappearing Parents. You heard the expression shattered families, very dramatic. Disappearing parents is the way we here in the community view what happens to these parents who leave children suddenly. They disappear into a system. Her report has won national acclaim. She has been helpful in educating many of us here on the trauma of women being separated from their children and not knowing when they will reunite. She has been very helpful in also educating the university community about the presence of these families in our community. Thank you. Nina.
Well, thank you so much, Lori, for all the work that you put into putting on this event. I think it's wonderful to see so many people come out for it. I also wanted to particularly thank Guillermina for her remarks. I think it's so important for somehow the voice of the children that are impacted to be heard, because I think one of the most disturbing things to me about this issue is how invisible it is, how people just don't see what's happening. The thing that got me interested in the issue was a specific client that I had. I co-direct the immigration clinic at the University of Arizona, and we represent primarily women that are detained in Eloy. And so working in the facility, I often run into the issue of family separation. In fact, it's usually at the forefront of my clients' concerns is their separation from their children. But this client had an issue that I hadn't seen before, which was that her children were in state custody. And she was encountering huge problems in trying to communicate with the state custody system from Eloy Detention Center. And over the course of, now it's almost 3 years that I've been representing her in her immigration case, it's been, I think, the most upsetting experience I've ever had as an attorney to watch her case play out. She has fought both her immigration case and her child welfare case and is losing both. And just last month, her parental rights were actually terminated for her 4 children, 3 of whom are US citizens. And I can say without a doubt, I've consulted many child welfare experts about her case, that the initial misdemeanor arrest that resulted in her detention and eventual deportation was not grounds for termination of parental rights. It's questionable whether it even would have resulted in removal of the children. But because she was immediately turned over to ICE, There was nowhere for the children to go. She has no relatives in this country. They were placed with a foster family. And then she spent 2 years in Eloy fighting her immigration case. And because of her unavailability to parent, the state moved to terminate her parental rights. She was eventually deported, even though her immigration case is still pending. And now yet another year has passed of frustrated attempts to reunify with her children. And last month, her parental rights were terminated. So as I watched this play out, and watched the inability of either system to register what was happening. So on the one hand, in immigration, we were continually saying to ICE, you need to release her. She can't participate in the child custody proceedings if she remains detained. She has no criminal history of any significance. She is not a flight risk because she needs to stay here to see her kids. They would not release her for 2 years. At the same time, in the child welfare system, she never met her social worker who was on the case. She never met the attorney representing her interests in the custody case. And we were continually trying to communicate to that system, she's only unavailable because she's detained. This has nothing to do with her fitness as a parent. And that also wouldn't register. So, experiencing this case, I wanted to know whether this is a fluky situation or this is something that actually is a systemic problem that's happening to others. And I got permission to do a series of surveys and interviews in Pima County Juvenile Court of judges, social workers, and attorneys who are involved in when children are brought into state custody. And I asked, how often are you encountering parents who are either detained or going through deportation proceedings? I had about over 50 surveys and then did 20 follow-up interviews with that mix of judges, social workers, and attorneys. And it became immediately apparent that this was not a fluky situation. Across the board, everybody had encountered these cases of parents being detained and deported. It wasn't the majority of their docket, but it was definitely something that they saw with regularity. And when I looked at just Spanish-speaking attorneys and caseworkers, they were arising with serious frequency, these cases. The other thing that became immediately apparent to me from the data was that the failure of the systems to communicate was happening not just in my client's case, that it was a total shutdown where the two systems are each failing parents in different ways that result in these tragic results. And what it does is it places parents in an impossible situation. If they're picked up and they're put in detention, they have to choose. Do they take the deportation and face deportation without their children and then trying to fight for reunification from their home country? Or do they stay and try to fight the deportation where they're in a detention facility that's totally unequipped to allow them to participate in the proceedings? And I don't know what you're supposed to do in that situation. There's no good outcome. And that's the situation that parents are in. The other thing that I just want to highlight that came through all the interviews and surveys from the perspective of the child welfare system was this idea of disappearing parents. This was the actual words that many people used to describe to me their experience when a parent was picked up by ICE. I'll read to you just one quote from, this is a CPS investigator, says, parents get taken to Pima County Jail. There we have them on a website. We know they're on an immigration hold. And then it seems like from 1 minute to the next, they disappear. What I mean by disappear is that they're no longer in Pima County Jail and we don't know where they went. As you know, INS facilities are not public, are not published. There's not a web page that we go to see if parents are there. It's just a big mess. And that was what I heard repeatedly, that literally people don't even know the phone numbers or names of these facilities, and so they can't locate the parents. And so the parents are totally cut out of the system. The other thing that I gathered from the interviews was the sense that parents are actually, and this came up in some of the other people's remarks, they're in some cases better off in jail than they are in immigration detention. Jail, there's, I'm sure, many problems with the way incarcerated parents experience the foster care system, but it is an acknowledged situation that parents face. There are mechanisms set up so that parents can be transported for hearings, so that they can take parenting classes or substance abuse counseling to make progress on their case plan for CPS. None of that can happen in a detention facility. There's no ability to have classes, there's no programming, visits are very difficult. Yali was talking about the budget cuts that CPS has. There's no way caseworkers have funding to go drive out to these facilities to do visits. Attorneys also are not making the visits happen. So people in detention are uniquely isolated and unable to participate. And I think that one of the things that is a failure on the child welfare system's part is that there's these mandatory timelines. So after a certain period of months pass, by law, the state has to move to terminate parental rights and move towards adoption. And there's good reason for that. There's concerns about children languishing in the child welfare system for long periods of time without some permanent plan. But that's not the situation of the parents in immigration detention. They're unavailable because these cases take so long to play out. And so to have the clock ticking on them just as it would for any other parent is really a failure to recognize the reality of what's happening with these families. So I don't want to take too much more time. I'd be happy to talk afterwards in more detail about both the specific cases that I've worked on as an attorney and also the data that I gathered. But I do think that it makes very plain that this is both a local and a national problem. And I think also one thing I do want to note is that the solutions can happen both locally and nationally. So nationally, there have been some indications that the Obama administration is acknowledging this problem, but it has not translated at all into actual practices on the ground. I think the #1 thing that ICE could do to address this problem would be to parole parents out who have CPS concerns. If the parent is not a flight risk, and most of them won't be if they're devoted to fighting for their kids, and there aren't security concerns, there's no reason to hold them in detention. And ICE has been totally unwilling to meet with me. I've been asking for a meeting since last May to discuss parole of these parents, and they don't respond to requests for parole. So I think that is an issue that's both local and national. I also think that having some point people in CPS to handle these issues, because they arise across the board, a small number of them arise. Caseworkers can't be equipped with the specialized knowledge to deal with them. If you had one person that was sort of the point person, I think that would make a huge difference in just the ability of the agency to handle these cases in a more sophisticated and sensitive way. So I will stop there, and I'm not sure who's next, so I'll turn the microphone.
Thank you, Nina. Nina has the particular ability to look at the local situation, and I do want to say that many local advocates agree that the solution is not just national, it's also local. We have a child protective services system here that is very eager to listen. Unfortunately, they've been held back from making the kinds of changes that they would like because of the confusion in state laws. And I use the word confusion as a sort of veil for the deep flaws that are in state law regarding child welfare and family welfare. But the system itself has many workers who are interested in learning more about immigration law, who are wanting to implement ways in which they can better communicate with ICE. They simply haven't had the tools, and I think we're going to see some changes in that direction, certainly with the encouragement of the community. Our last speaker today will be introduced by Kat, as we'll have one more family representative. And then we will hear a couple of recommendations and then be open for questions and or interviews.
As I mentioned earlier, we have a hotline that we put out in the community for folks to call in emergencies and situations that are after hours or on the weekends. And Patricia Moreno is also one of our promotoras, and she's one of the individuals that mostly staffs the phone line. And so I've invited her to talk about a couple of the types of cases that we've had come into the phone line.
Hi. We have a lot of cases, very sad cases. We have one of the cases where the two children were getting out from the church, and they were stopped at the highway patrol. In an hour, the family came find the children. I think they put her in a foster care on Phoenix. They took like 3 months to reunite them. They asked them for the parents' fingerprints, and they were tested by tuberculosis, and they got a pregnancy test. One of the children were 13, and the other one were 9 years old. And they were allowed just to make 1 call per week. And the parents were really, really, really scared to talk about the case. We have another cases that the parents were pulled out on the streets, and they took by the border patrol, and the kids were crying in the streets. Now we have 2 cases, and that the children are living with the aunts or grandpas because we don't know what happened with the parents. Also, we have another case that the children is with the grandma because her mama is in detention, and she's going to be deported this month. So these are some cases that we have to deal every day, a lot of sad cases.
And one important thing to note about the calls that come in, people like to think that immigration is a federal issue, it's a federal problem, and we're only seeing the issues on federal levels. But most of the calls that come in, the interaction or how people end up in deportation is through police, through local law enforcement. And we cannot forget that this connection to the deaths on the border, to the deportations, to all of the things that we're seeing, the raids, all of this, many of them are instigated by local law enforcement. And it's absolutely important, imperative that we make those connections and that we challenge state efforts like Arizona's, Alabama, Georgia, all of the others that are replicating the anti-immigrant laws that are being passed, and make that connection that when a police officer calls ICE or calls Border Patrol, it's not just that that person is going to get picked up or taken away. You're talking about a family that is destroyed, that's separated, that may take years to reunite if they're able to reunite, or individuals who actually may die in that crossing process again. And so it's really, I mean, it's a connection that, no offense to the media, but nobody makes. Nobody's making that connection. And we cannot let local law enforcement off the hook. And they also need to understand the effects of what happens when they are contacting Border Patrol, when they're calling ICE. Because these kinds of things have ripple effects and are destroying families and are affecting not just immigrants and migrants, but U.S. citizen children. Thank you.
I think it's important to know that in Arizona, each of the 15 counties are part of the Secure Communities apparatus, although not all local jurisdictions have 287G agreements with the federal government. The Secure Communities Agreement does allow each county to employ local law enforcement in these kinds of decisions regarding children and families. So it's very close to us here on the ground. And as I want to reinforce what Kat has said, and what some of you may not realize, and that is that local police instigate many of the processes that bring families into these catastrophic situations. So they need our support in understanding what it is that happens when they make that phone call. And we implore you to stay in touch with local law enforcement and help them realize what happens, the entire chain of events that occurs when these families are taken away from their children. That ends our press conference, other than a couple of recommendations, and I know each speaker has had some recommendations, and I may have, you may be fortunate in that I might have lost my recommendations, but I think I can give them to you by heart because we work on this so often. One of them, as Nina had mentioned, is that Child Protective Services needs the opportunity, or she began to mention that they need more training, that we hope that that will occur, that they need more training in immigration processes, And they need to lose their fear, and I think the more training and exposure they have and the more knowledge they have that these children, similar to children affected by the Indian Child Welfare Act, deserve full treatment, deserve to be with their parents, and there are certain processes that allow that to happen. They need to learn those, we need to help them do that. We urge the Child Protective Services personnel to stay, thank you, to stay in touch with the local consulate. As I mentioned, the Mexico consulate here is a very helpful one. Calls to the consulate can allow for visits from parents who are deported, phone calls from parents on the other side, searching for relatives who may be suitable to take care of children so they can leave the child foster care system. Even a deportation should not stop a family from being reunited. So employ those consulates. They are located in Yuma, the Mexico consulate in Yuma, Phoenix, this area, and there's a whole network online. Very helpful and very necessary. We want to promote, as Yali was saying, prosecutorial discretion. Much more use of that. You recall that last August or the end of July, the administration said there were 300,000 cases they wanted to review individually because many of them were not ones that would merit deportation ordinarily. Crimes were so insignificant that people would be released from detention. We urge you to write letters to your congressional representatives to start implementing that process. That has not really been implemented yet, and many of the people caught in that process, in that 300,000, are people that we've met at Eloy and at other locations. So let's start using prosecutorial discretion to let those people go, let them stay with their families, and particularly where there are children involved, that there be expedited release so that these families can fight their immigration case on the outside, even if necessary with some sort of monitoring device, so that they can be together with their children. Finally, we want to make sure that, let me just get to that, that lawyers in our community be supported in working with the juvenile court as well as Child Protective Services in offering remedies for youth who are unable to reunite with their parents. Unfortunately, there is that population that will not, that is either here on their own or that are no longer able to reunite with deported parents. They are eligible for specific legal remedies, including special immigrant juvenile status, SIJS, as well as a number of visas. And these need to be promoted. These are able to be employed in the juvenile court. The juvenile court is becoming more aware of them. It's very important that Child Protective Services and community advocates press the state and the judicial system to employ immigration attorneys on a regular basis so that they can consult with our child protective system so that they can provide these remedies to these deserving youth. Thank you very, very much for your attention and for your participation.